Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Welcome to Relationships Inside Out today. We will be talking about addiction or substance use in families, relationships.
Yep. One thing we want to make sure it's really clear here, is when we talk about addiction and substance use, we are not just talking about drugs and alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the addiction or dependency on drugs and alcohol, but also it can be tobacco, caffeine, it can be
Gambling,
gambling, sex, control.
Yeah.
Right. These vices that we use to kind of pull us out from the reality of what is, essentially.
Yeah. And this could look like a child growing up in this context, or you're in a romantic relationship where a partner is experiencing addiction to some extent, and what that looks like.
So how often do you see this show up in your practice, Greg, or how important is it in your work?
It happens quite often. I wouldn't say it's the majority of what I see, but maybe that's just a clientele that's seeking me out.
Sure.
It's difficult because not only you work in a relationship, but you work on a relationship to navigate this addiction. And depending on how couples feel or families feel, it plays a role in there. So I'll give you an example is they look at it as a separate entity that they're working together as a unified front to fight, or this is their problem. How dare them bring this in, their resentment, things like that. And just even the perception of what that looks like can play a role in how we move forward with it and how it impacts us as a family. And I think about it as a kid growing up, they're more likely to adapt and walk on eggshells, and maybe even be parentified, right? Take on a lot of parental roles to take care and make sure parent is safe. And I mean, there's just a lot of things it can do. And so when couples come in, that might not be the presenting problem right away. So when you ask like how many couples I see, maybe we haven't gotten to that yet, or
good point.
It never came up. But a lot of the stuff we talked about in previous couple stuff and dynamics and arguments, I mean, this could be a factor, depression thing. I mean, when we're diagnosing, we have to rule out that these symptoms are not due to like substances, for example. So,
but even that, like, there's so many different models and ways of looking at this. One of the most common is disease model, right?
Yeah.
Addiction is a disease, but that addiction, at least the way I conceptualize in my practice, is often a symptom rather than the problem itself, if that makes sense. It is a sign that something else is amiss. It is a sign that we're struggling. And perhaps because of childhood or access to resources, this is the best coping skill I've got in order to manage my depression, anxiety, fear, whatever it might be. Yeah.
And that's one conceptualization of it, is that it's for coping. Another one is somebody could be fine and they're living their life, and then they get college, they start drinking, and they just have a genetic predisposition for addiction. Becomes
almost like a way of life.
Yeah. Well, but even so, as they take that sip and it just responds in their body differently, they have a genetic predisposition that is actually, it drives that addiction a little more, right?
In either case, it's important to note, I will work some with addictions if they come in my door. It's definitely not my niche, right? But by way of working with couples and partners and things, it happens.
Yeah.
But it's important to note here that addiction often, I'm going to say often, I'm not going to say always, often isn't something we can just will away or stop, right? When people say like, just stop drinking, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
I wish it were. I wish for anyone who struggles with gaming addiction, any of them, that it was as simple as, well, just stop. That sounds really lovely. But the reality is, there is a shift in brain chemistry and physiology and bodily response, our hormones, endocrine system, you name it, that makes it a much more difficult feat than just stop.
I love that, because psychoeducation is a useful tool when working with families, is educating on what this process looks like, expectations around it. And one thing to help kind of depersonalize it from that individual is talking about what it does in the brain, and talk about why it's not easy to shut it off. I mean, when we think about the brain and what substances are doing, it inhibits that logic, rational thought. This is why if somebody's currently using a therapy, it actually is not helpful for us to continue therapy until the substance is treated first. Because there's a lot of skills where you need that part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, to work through this stuff. And so when that's not happening, the inhibition's not there, right?
Yep.
Then you're more likely to pick it up. And after a while, right, whatever that feeling that somebody's getting from that substance or addiction, that brain needs that. And if you replace it with something else that's not that substance, the analogy I always use is the substance is like a megaphone. And when you replace it with, like, say, exercise, it might give some of the same like response, but it's like a whisper. And so there's a lot more motivation to want to use again, because we're not getting the same effect from other things, right? And the challenging part, this is the challenging part, is when somebody decides to make that step and abstain from whatever that is, that brain has spent time, right, adapting to the chemicals and the new homeostasis in their brain. And say, for example, it stops producing as much of a serotonin, right? So it stops producing as much because it's like, well, I'm getting enough through this substance. Then you get off that substance, that brain is still at that level of not producing as much. And then you get a lot of mood swings, I mean, this process is very, very difficult. And that brain
withdrawal can actually be dangerous.
Yeah.
Because when we withdraw, like you're saying, it substitutes in, say, dopamine.
Yeah.
If we then just withdraw what our brain has been relying on, especially for years, with that dopamine drip, and now our brain isn't producing dopamine, we can have seizures, we can have vomiting, we can have hallucinations. Like, it can actually be really dangerous. And so an important part of this is, if you are in the trenches, especially with substance use, so taking something in, ingesting it, getting proper support along the withdrawal.
Medically.
Yes. Not cold turkey, white knuckling. And as a partner, understanding that it is a process. It's not a moment. And just because we get sober, like, people talk about, like, I just want you to be sober. Sober is not the goal. That is a step in the goal, but recovery is the goal. It is working through what led us here. How do we maintain a plan to stay sober when we relapse? Because let's face it, most of the time relapse happens.
It's part of the recovery.
What are we going to do? How are we going to recalibrate and get back on our feet? That is more of what we're working towards, not just being clean from substances or using video games less or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And that goes back to the psychoeducation, right? Like, we just talked about the brain a little bit. And I mean, we can go days on the brain part, but even just what you talked about is the expectation of what this looks like lifelong. And for couples, that is this something that I want to join them on the journey with? And that's a fair question. Is this something that I can do based on where I'm at right now as an individual? And if I am, how do I do that? How do I best support? And setting that expectation, especially earlier on, right? The mood swings after they're withdrawing, just how do you be part of that process, and understanding where those resources are for safety, especially withdrawing from like stimulants and things like that, right?
Yep. And I want to spend a minute here. Why we talk about video game addiction in the same camp as alcohol addiction or cocaine addiction. In any case, if we're addicted to something, a good cue is to be without it. We can't focus on other things. We might feel physically ill. We get pretty agitated, irritable, even aggressive. We might feel lethargic, or we just feel generally unwell without this thing. And that can happen with video games or even sex addictions.
Yeah. And a couple of things you see: dependency, right? This is, I need it. I engage in behaviors to get it. And then there's the withdrawal, the physiological symptoms.
I don't just want it. I need it.
Yeah. Like caffeine. People have experienced withdrawals, but do they engage in that dependency? I mean, that's really kind of a couple of things they look at. And then another thing too, I know in the research side of things, they have gambling addiction in there.
Yep.
And it's because of how they mapped its response in the brain. Very similar to how another substance was. And they saw that kind of same response.
Yep. The same parts of the brain light up. And question I ask people is, how does it impact your life? Is it taking away from my time as a parent? Am I getting sick? Do I need this in order to function? Am I missing work? Am I losing sleep? Is my physical health deteriorating? These are all signs that we're kind of in the throes of it.
Yeah. And one concern I have too is a child. In how they adapt to this. You know, I think about a parent who is blacked out. What is that child doing?
Or raging, or
raging.
Even if they're awake, but can't take care of them, can't change their diaper, can't feed them, can't properly supervise.
Yeah. Well, they can't be present.
Yeah.
And here's a child trying to connect with and a parent, and that parent doesn't remember because they blacked out. And so the memory of that interaction is even gone. I mean, there's just a lot of complications around this, a lot of things to
for
consider.
That child, they're more prone now to also use to cope with their hurt, to cope with their attachment injuries as a result of that parent choice. So breaking that generational pattern really stinking hard. Like it's not light lifting. In my own life, I've been around a lot of people who are addicted in my family and otherwise. And having to make a really conscious choice and have a conversation openly with my husband to plan for that. So I didn't have my first sip of alcohol until I was 21. We have a rule of, and this is a personally imposed, this is not my husband imposing, I won't drink unless I am fully happy. There's any tinge of stress, depression, anxiety, I'm not going to consume. And I've never done any other drugs because I know for me what it felt like watching other people go through this as a kid and as an adult. But also I know I am more prone to addiction by engaging even a little bit. So getting
because
to know,
family, the genetic piece, right?
Genetic and behavioral. And so getting to know your own family of origin, getting to know your own triggers and honoring them. Is it always easy to say no? No. But I have to think about my priorities. I have to think about what's safe and healthy for my body.
Yeah. And your boundaries of what role you play in that recovery process.
Yeah.
There are people who want to help, family that want to help, but it may not be effective, right? Threatening, giving them all the reasons of how, their heart's going to give out or their liver is going to give out, and all this like threatening and warnings and stuff that doesn't necessarily always help. And most of the time it does not help.
Sure.
It's deeper, right?
So then what do they do in absence of that? I get that question all the time. What do you tell people? And then I'll share kind of what I do.
Well, I think questioning and asking what that person needs and if they see a role for me to help, not me as a person, but if I'm the family member, right? Sure. So being curious about what that person is going to need through this process, where they're at, not pushing them. Some people are not in that stage to want change. Maybe they're contemplating it, but they're not ready for like planning or taking action yet. And so being very patient with that process, which is very, very hard, especially if you get some manipulations in this. Yeah. So really the thing is assessing the need of the person who might be suffering is the first step for me, because if we try to engage in the behaviors that work for us, it may not be effective for them, and it might increase their distress and ultimately even increase their use.
Which I do want to put a caveat on that. It's never the other person's fault, right?
Yeah.
Like I'll hear people say like, I don't want to do this because it'll make them drink. It'll make them use. I want to dispel that myth a little bit of it's never your fault that someone else is using.
Yeah. But you can take steps to help mitigate what might be causing that, which is stress.
Another thing I offer to people is, okay, often addiction isn't like a week long. Well, it isn't a week long. It's years. If you're finding that even a loved one, even a family member or a best friend, that their addiction is harming your psychological well-being, isn't healthy for your system, it's okay to set up a boundary. It's okay to choose to not give them money, to not let them sleep in your house, to not enable, essentially, and to not engage in that relationship if it doesn't feel safe. So having that boundary of, I love you, and when you're using, I can't be in that space with you. And that's okay too. It's painful.
Yeah.
And it's hard to relinquish that. We can't control their addiction. We can't control them getting into treatment. They have to want to go. Yeah. And sometimes it's absolutely necessary, which is really hard to reconcile. But people we want connection with, we may not be able to.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most difficult parts for the person who's in the family and not using is how to be. What is my presence in here? What is my role? And figuring that out. And typically if I see that partner grew up in a family where there's addictions, they tend to be the one that wants to help and be that support, which is fine. But are we doing it in a healthy way? Are we doing it in a way that's effective for this person? And are you not losing yourself in this? Because codependency in relationships comes up big time.
Absolutely.
With this, they're walking on eggshells. That's right. The codependency, this kind of, I need to manage and make sure their emotions are safe.
I have to keep them from.
Yeah.
It's not your responsibility. You can't keep them from. I have tried with people I love in that role. And the reality is, can't keep them from it.
Yeah.
You can't tell them what to do. And that's really hard truth to reconcile. But what you can do, right? It's focusing on what you can control. I can't control their use. I can't control what they do. But what I can control is how I'm going to interact with them, is what I'm going to allow into my space or around my children or around my family or whatever it might be. That's the piece I can control, right? So it's, if you're going to continue using, if you're not going to seek treatment, okay. And I'm going to choose space.
What are your thoughts around the different perceptions of that family member of whether that person's use is of their own volition or not, and how that maybe influences support or not?
Ooh, it's a tricky one. You're talking about the addict?
Yeah. So like the family member sees the person who's using as, well, that's their choice, or this is addiction. This is a disease.
Well, I don't see it as choice. I do think boundaries are necessary. And this is where it might get a little complicated, right? By model, by perspective, by personal experience, that I thoroughly believe no one is born wanting to be an addict. 100%. I think life takes them there, and biology and a whole bunch of things. And it doesn't mean I have to tolerate it in my space. So it's, to me, my camp is, you're not choosing to be an addict. I don't believe that. I don't believe anyone wants to be in that state, but there is some choice in the next steps we take. And if I'm not saying just ditch someone right as they're an addict, right? This is after maybe years of giving support. This is after you're depleting your own mental health, energy, financial resources, whatever it might be, that then we say, you know, this is out of my control and is actually unhealthy for my system.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I'm in the same camp as you in terms of school of thought around that. When I work with families, I tend to explore how they think about that person's addiction and have them think about, well, how does that perception shape whether you help them or not, and how you help them or not. Good point. If you see it as a disease, maybe there's a little more empathy, right? But there's still people who talk about, I shouldn't say talk about, but have difficulty seeing it as a disease and using that disease model.
They see it just purely as a choice.
A choice. And that affects, that attribution you have about it being a choice affects whether you give them any sympathy or want to help or support. So I think that perception plays a big role. And that's why I think a first step for family is really just go get some education about this process. What does it look like? What might be going on for that person who's struggling? They might not even have known that was something that was going to happen to them. And I think about cases of they went in for a surgery and had pain pills,
pain opioids. Oof.
And that's one that's running rampant, right? And so thinking about what can we do? What is this? What is happening? What is my role? And just getting that education to make an informed decision of that process and how you can best support or not. I mean, hopefully there's some support of in some level, but what does that look like for that person?
And sometimes it is some of those tough boundaries, right? Especially if we're the like relationship partner or marital partner of the addict, of getting them into treatment, of abstaining yourself so that you can support them in sobriety. Because if my partner is fresh in sobriety or 20 years, doesn't matter, and I'm sitting there drinking in front of them, that might set them up for failure. Yeah. So how can I support and love them? Am I going to shame them and say, you're a piece of shit for this? No. But again, it also doesn't look like I'm here to just love you through the whole thing and pray for you, and we'll see if it gets better and here's some more money. Yeah. I've had partners who say, I resent them for this addiction because now I can't drink. Now I can't engage in these things. And I think this goes back to what you talked about. And is that something you're willing to want to do and give up for this person? I mean, this is part of that process. And not just tolerate, not just like white knuckle through, but accept. There's a difference between, yeah, I'm going to do it and I'm going to hate you for it. And I'm going to do this because I love you and accept that this is my world. Yeah. Those are two different ways of interacting. Yeah. And another thing that comes up in terms of resentment is I resent them for ruining what we had, especially if it came in later in the relationship, ruining what we had and working through that anticipated loss, that loss of what they expected it to be. So getting that support in, Again, this is one of those where it's not just support for the addict, it's support for the system. In alcohol, it's AA for the addict, Al-Anon for the system. Same with narcotics and other substances like that. But it's getting therapy. It is just like an affair, recovering from it.
Yes.
It's talking about the betrayal, talking about the potential breaches in trust or pain or neglect to the relationship or family, whatever it might be, and repairing through that process. But it takes active choice to repair and to recover. And it takes effort on both sides, not just the addict.
And of note, I think it's really important, is there are different cultures around recovery.
Yeah.
Some people are like, oh, I'm not religious. There are AA meetings that are a little bit away from that, right? So
some are completely agnostic.
So finding one that fits, not all of them are the same. There's even smart recovery, which is like another rendition of it. There's different things for family, different supports for family. And, you know, I've had clients who say, I don't like groups. I don't want to go there and have to share my stuff. There's individual therapists who specialize in this, certified addiction counselors, right?
Inpatient, intensive outpatient. Like there's
so many options.
And if you even say, like we're in Windsor, Fort Collins, if you go look at Fort Collins AA groups, there are so many of them. It's not just one or two. And each one is a different culture. Some are light and playful and laughter. Some are serious and somber. Some are faith-centered. Some are not. There's really, so testing them out, much like we've talked about testing out therapists, testing out your resources. You might have a stigma against AA, but have you gone?
Yeah.
Have you tried?
And
have you tried a different one?
And you might be of the desire to not fully abstain and learn how to have moderation. Finding a therapist that, and a group that actually values that and sees. But
here's the thing about that. That in and of itself is controversial.
It is, but that's not from Places of Joy. And of course, if there's a severe risk and there's been a history of this stuff, you have that conversation with I'll have that conversation with the client, but thinking about what does it mean in their life, but ultimately taking steps is the first thing that's important to me.
I think another thing I talk to people about is not just replacing this addiction with a new one. So I'll hear people, this shouldn't be a joke, but it's people talk about like being California sober. Have you ever heard this?
No.
It's I'm sober from alcohol and cocaine essentially, but I'm using marijuana. And supplementing in marijuana at a constant basis throughout the day. Or, okay, I'm off of substances, but now I seek out prostitutes. Now I seek out porn. Now I seek out video games. Now I seek out control, like intensive control of my environment.
Relationship codependency. Now my relationship is my addiction. It goes back to what you were talking about kind of in the beginning of, well, does it impair your functioning?
Yeah.
Does it affect your relationships? What is it doing in your life? Is it helpful or not? What value does it bring to you?
Yeah.
And really evaluating, oh, okay, maybe this isn't something, this is something I should consider, maybe something I shouldn't be doing. We're doing a lot of shouldn't on each other and shouldn't on this process. But
it's hard, it's complex, because even if you have 2 alcoholics, 5 alcoholics, none of them are gonna have the same path. None of them are gonna have the same reasons or rationale, if there is rationale. None of them are gonna have the same motivations for sobriety.
Yeah.
They all look so different.
And you're not alone in this process.
Yeah.
These programs, these things have been early 1900s, some of them have existed.
Yeah.
This has been around for a while. You're not alone in this process, and you don't have to be. It doesn't have to be scary. And there's so many resources out there now that you can choose which path you might want to do, or something that might align a little more with your path that you're desiring.
But if you're in a partnership, working as a team on this, rather than demonizing one partner or saying you have to do it my way, that won't get very far. So how do we as a partnership set new expectations? How do we enter recovery? And if my partner is not willing to seek recovery, how do I as an individual either reconcile that this is their self and this is what they're going to choose to do, or how do I move forward without them?
Yeah. Those are the hard decisions. This is why it's so difficult, because this is what we talked about earlier, boundary violation, this feel of betrayal. Is this something that you have the capacity to work with? Grief. To forgive.
I talk about grief a lot with people, of people who are trying to stay connected with the person who's addicted. trying to stay in relationship, trying to help them, trying to quote, save them. And at some point we have to recognize that's out of our control.
Mm-hmm.
So it's grieving what relationship may not be. Maybe they will get sober and you can get there. Maybe they won't. So it's grieving, damn, like I really wanted, or I really thought this relationship would work. I really thought so-and-so could get sober. I miss my mom. I miss this friend. And the fact is they're not healthy in my space.
Yeah.
So we have to grieve what we can't control.
Yeah. And something you said made me think of the idea of partners putting conditions.
Tell me more about that.
Well, if you use again, this is going to happen. And it's dangerous because, as we talked about earlier, part of the recovery process, relapse is highly possible. They're going to fail you. And what does that do to that person who's trying to live up to that condition? Further beating themselves up, further getting a sense of failure. And so conditions aren't helpful.
How do you reconcile that with boundaries in your practice?
Well, so boundaries to me would be if I'm not willing to do this. A condition is, if you're able to do this, then I'll reward you with this. Or if you do this, I'm going to punish you with this, right? There's this condition upon it. Boundaries are, I know what's best for me. I'm aware of what I need and what I'm willing to put up with and what I'm not. To me, there's a distinct difference in that. How about for you?
It gets muddled, right? Because then if you look at a boundary of, okay, I'm not willing to put up with this, there has to be a consequence that follows, which almost feels conditional or like an ultimatum to some people. But there's a qualitative difference, at least when I think about them, of boundaries are choosing health. They are choosing to set a limit and then make a subsequent choice if that limit is breached. An ultimatum or that conditional response is driven more, or tends to be out of punishment or control.
Yeah, control. Yeah.
And thus has a very different intention and quality to it than a healthy boundary.
Yeah. And typically I'll see too is, are you following through with that boundary?
Great question.
If it's just sitting there and it's continually being, I'm going to leave if you don't do this, I'm going to leave, I'm going to leave. And that's not healthy either, because that induces stress. And again, it's not your fault that if that stress leads to more use, but thinking about what can we do differently to not exacerbate or intensify this stuff, and conditions and putting condition on it is not the best.
This is one of those topics that when I think about it, makes me sad. Like I just feel sad because often when people, like I hear people talk about people who are addicted or addictions and they just say, oh God, can you believe that they do this? In my heart, when I look at people who are using or addicted to video games, anything, I'm just sad because what is it in their space and their body that has taken them there? What keeps them there? If you have someone who, say, is an alcoholic and you could transport them into a sober body, they wouldn't look and be like, that looks like a fun life. I really want to shoot up some heroin again.
Yeah.
They won't.
Yeah.
But yet they're there. So it just makes, like, if we can use that empathy, use that compassion with healthy boundaries. I'm a huge one on healthy boundaries here. That can go a long way in kind of softening how we think about them, softening how we think about addiction.
Yeah. And you brought up a good point in terms of what is going on for them. How did they get there? And I think of trauma. Trauma is a big one. And and the reason why it's really important to talk about right now in this context, and of course we're hitting substance use more broadly, and we'll have episodes that go a little bit more with precision on certain areas of it. But for now, more broadly, trauma, it's how do you treat that? If trauma is driving the use, but you abstain, now what do you have managing the symptoms of the trauma?
Great
or
question.
if you deal with the trauma, but then the addiction's still there, and then the addictions can lead to more trauma. I mean, there's a lot of finesse around this, and making sure that we're working to kind of identify other underlying things that are driving this this need to use or go out and gamble or whatever the addiction may be that is having a negative impact on your life, relationships, work, things like that. But again, thinking what skills are going to need to be in place to help.
Replacement skills. We don't replace with a new addiction.
Yeah, replacement, exactly. And that is tough because there's some models that want to do the addiction first. And then you think about, well, what does that happen when you leave that trauma there? And that's not touched.
It's being avoided for a reason or potentially, right? And so what coping skills do we get in there? I can't emphasize this enough too. we've talked about how it's important to be with a therapist who's skilled
Mm-hmm.
in your area. Addictions is not my area. So if I have someone reach out who says, I'm really trying to get sober, I'm going to refer them to someone else. Not because I don't want to take them on or feel anything other than compassion for them, but because if you're working with someone who isn't really skilled in this area, because it takes so much finesse, more damage can actually be done than good if not handled well. And so if you, your friend or partner, someone looking for treatment or support, I cannot emphasize this enough. Find someone who specializes in this, who has accreditations in this, who I think it's CAC training, who
certified addiction counselors, and there's different levels. Yeah.
Who actually knows the ins and outs of this, who has experience, so that they can do this with that finesse it requires, with the compassion it requires to minimize the harmful side effects of it.
And there's also peer support models.
Yeah.
So there are people who are part of treatments where they themselves have gone through this process and they're alongside you. And that peer support helps normalize it. That's why I love groups. Groups help normalize it. I know people feel uncomfortable talking about it, but it normalizes the process to know that you're not alone. And the peer support helps in the sense of you maybe not be in a group, but you have a peer that's
who gets it.
That's assigned to you with a provider, right? So you might have a certified addiction counselor and then a peer, or primary care provider or therapist, and then a peer who's gone through it as well.
If you're with even in my own partnership, when I talk about my trauma, my husband wants to love on me and support me, and he has no idea what that's like. So finding someone who knows what it's like, who I have a friend who knows what it's like to lose a mom, like I have. Even though my husband knows me better than any human, she can provide support in ways he can't.
Insights.
Simply by way of knowing or relating to that lived experience.
Yeah. Any last minute, we kind of touched again broadly, and in future episodes, we'll go a little bit more finite into certain contexts of addiction. Is there any last minute tips or things that we can think of?
I think about this idea of, okay, if you're the addicted person or you're with someone who is, you're not a bad person. This doesn't determine your character. It doesn't determine anything other than this is a coping skill that's not serving you. And that's what needs to change.
Or something impacting your life that right now is out of control.
But it doesn't mean you are a bad person.
Right. I love that. Yeah. I love that compassion for yourself. Because if we continually beat ourselves up, drives our self-esteem, it could be another thing that drives continual use. Yeah, I love that. Another one is you're not alone.
Absolutely.
The process might take multiple times. It's not perfect. It doesn't look the same.
Give yourself grace. Give your partner a little grace. If you're struggling to find the resources, reach out. We're happy to help provide, especially in Colorado and Wyoming. Reach out to, you can even Google addiction certifications, addiction therapist groups. Try them out. I know they're scary. And I can tell you from my experience, when someone is in recovery and actually starts to process through sobriety, what that means, and is kind of on the other side of it, no one ever regrets recovery and sobriety. And future generations will thank you. So if you can, get the support, give the support, and don't be afraid of healthy boundaries.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to look at it, how it might be impacting your life if you're not aware of it now.
Yeah.
To put those boundaries in place.
Good point. Good point.
So, and don't be afraid of shopping around, looking at this process, figuring out what's best for you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining. This has been Relationships Inside Out. Feel free to email us with any questions, if you need referrals, ideas, topic suggestions, anything, at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. And we look forward to chatting more about what makes relationships healthy and unhealthy, and ways to kind of beef up those healthy skills.
Perfect. Thank you.